Have you ever wondered when you take pictures with an action camera like a GoPro, it looks weird and distorted, which means that straight lines do not look straight, they look bent and curved. Do you ever wondered if animals see the world in that way? The fun fact is that a lot of animals like fishes actually have vision which are similar to that of a GoPro. And that's one of the reasons why some of these lenses are called fish eye lenses. But for us, it's much harder to interpret these kind of images. Or maybe your robot needs to have these kind of lenses to look at a very wide field of view or like a lot of the scene in the world. But we want to interpret straight lines as straight, but they appear curved in this kind of scenario. So how do we correct for this distortion by undistorting the lens parameters? Let's dive right into the math today and demystify the world of lens distortion. So let's sort of look at an overview of what we are trying to do. So remember that from the previous video, we had this pinhole projection equation where we talked about how the image from the 3 dimensions is being projected onto a 2-dimensional image plane. But we never talked about this parameter called the lens configuration, which is an intrinsic parameter which characterizes how the lens bends the light. So we did talk about the spatial relationship between the sensor and the pinhole, and we talked about the camera body extrinsic configuration, which is like how the camera is orientated in the world. So let's talk about this lens parameter, which essentially gives you that cool GoPro kind of look. So let's imagine we are taking a picture of a checkerboard or a chessboard. So in this particular case, it's a simplified model. We have a simple 3x3 grid, and it's like alternating black and white tiles. And we know that like the lines, the horizontal lines and the vertical lines are straight. So we are going to make an assumption here before we dive right in, because like mathematically modeling a function which is arbitrary is really complicated. So let's say the distortion has some structure to it, like it's like not completely random, it has some method to this madness. So the assumption we are going to make is that the lens distortion, or the way this checkerboard is going to be seen as bent, is a function of the distance from the principal point. Remember that the principal point is generally the center of the image. It's the line where the optical center passes through the image, and generally is around the center of the image. So what we want to do is we want to get these corrected coordinates. Here x represents both the x and y coordinates, and L represents this function, and where R is basically the radial distance from the principal point to that corresponding point, which is simply the L2 distance, right? Okay, this is great. And X distortion is basically the raw original coordinates which we capture through the image. Okay, if the image is perfect without distortion, L is just going to be an identity function. So, and L follows a specific formulation. In this particular case, it follows this beautiful formulation where we have it as a function of r square, r power 4 and r power 6. We have these coefficients k1, k2 and k5 which manipulate how much this function distorts the image. And this, because it only depends upon the radial function, which is like the radial distance, is called the radial distortion. In this particular formulation, almost always when you practically implement this and actually like get the values of k1, k2 and k5, it's going to be in a way that like k1 is greater than k2 and it's greater than k5. And remember again, just to recap, r is the radial distance of the point with respect to the principal point, which is generally the center of the image, which is the L2 distance as given here. Let's recall some basic high school math. So let's take a simple plot. Let's plot the function of x square, and that's a simple upward parabola. I want you to take a second and ponder how x power 4 is going to look like in this plot. So as you might have guessed, x power 4 is more closer inside to the vertical because it raises up much faster. What about x power 6? Again, x power 6 is going to be even closer than x power 4. As we keep bumping up the powers of x, it's going to get closer and closer to the vertical much faster. So what I want to do now instead is like add x square and multiply x bar 4 with another number, add that up, and multiply x bar 6 with a completely different number. Depending on these coefficients of x square, x bar 4 and x bar 6, it will lie in between any of these curves. In this particular case, because we are going to add a very small fraction of x bar 4 and x bar 6, let's say x square plus 0.01 x bar 4 and 0.001 x bar 6, take a guess where it's going to lie. If you guessed it's going to lie between x square and x bar 4, you're absolutely correct, right? And this doesn't necessarily have to be very intuitive. This is more like, hey, like depending on how much fraction of x bar 4 I'm adding, if it's going to be high, it's going to basically then show up on the left hand side of the x bar 4. If it's very small, it's going to show up on the right hand side because x squared technically dominates. Okay, great. So what if I basically do like flip the sign of x squared? So minus x squared plus 0.01 x bar 4 plus 0.001 x bar 6. What is going to happen now? As you would imagine, when the values are small, x square is going to dominate and it's negative sign, so it's going to go down. But there is going to be a point where the right hand side component, which is 0.01 x bar 4 and 0.001 x bar 6, is going to be much greater than the minus x squared term, which means that overall it's going to be positive. So it's initially going to be negative and then it's going to be overall positive. And of course at x equal to 0, it's going to be 0. So it's going to look like this. So it basically has one maxima at 0 and then two minima again, and then it's going to extend up to infinity. Great. So now let's continue doing this. So we essentially want to model the way lens bends the light or things, which means that straight lines will not be straight. And that's what we have been doing till now. And we want to use this mathematical function r square, r bar 4, r bar 6 to sort of mathematically like represent that. So if your k1 is negative, like we have seen before, this distortion is called the barrel distortion. Remember, the checkerboard was beautiful and straight, but in our GoPro, it looks like really bent, right? Like it's like somebody punched the image from the back, so it looks like a barrel. And this is an image of a barrel, so it resembles that, and that's why it's called the barrel distortion. So let's go back to our square checkerboard from before, and if we basically make k positive, this is called the pincushion distortion because it looks like a pincushion where the image has been punched in the center where it has gone inside, right? And remember that here the functions look opposite because like we are using the inverted version of this to get the undistorted version. Okay, but till now we have perfectly assumed that the sensor plane and the lens plane are perfectly parallel to each other. But in reality, when you sort of manufacture this, especially for cheaper cameras like the ones in your smartphones, what could happen is this lens plane is not perfectly parallel. It's a little bit bent in x and y both axes, right? So essentially what it will give you is an image which is a little weird. Remember that this is an extremely exaggerated image. It's never going to be this bad unless the camera is like really, really cheap. But practically this can happen, right? So in this particular case, after a lot of derivation, I would urge you to refer to this paper. You will get the coordinates for the correction and distortion as so. And you have these parameters called K3 and K4, which you want to estimate. And this is called the tangential distortion. And this paper is super old. It's about much greater than 59 years ago. And it's like one of the finest papers in literature, which we still use to model these distortions because like lens making hasn't changed much in the last 100 years. We have gotten really good at making images have like less noise and basically less fringing, like basically colors bending to different amounts. But the distortion still remains fairly similar because the lens making methods date back hundreds of years, right? So when you combine the radial model from before and the tangential model from what we are discussing now, we get the most common distortion correction model, which is called the Rad-Tan model. Again, just to recap, it uses the radial and tangential parameters which is most commonly used. The general rule of thumb is also to neglect the tangential distortion, as it's generally fairly small. Like we discussed, modern smartphone cameras or modern cameras actually have tangential distortion to be very less because it's completely automated and made to high precision, right? Remember that we used a thing called the pinhole model that still exists. The pinhole model is for projection, how 3D gets projected onto the 2D. Rad-Tan model is basically for distortion correction, which is straight lines in your image do not appear straight. So how do we manufacture this or change this image in a way that straight lines appear straight? That's using the Rad-Tan model. So the pinhole model is 3D to 2D. Rad-Tan model is basically to make bendy lines straight. To do this, you generally don't have to write your own code. You can use something like the ETH Zurich's Kalibr Toolbox, or OpenCV's built-in calibration tool, or MATLAB's camera calibration tool. This is all great, but what are the issues with a model like this? So this model implicitly assumes that you're working with relatively smaller fields of view, and it works really well for like something less than 70 degrees field of view. I have practically used this up to 90 degrees field of view and it works fairly well. And it makes an implicit assumption that the distortion is fairly small. If you take this model and apply it to the GoPro image like in the first start of the video, or as we discussed, it was not going to work really well. So what we want to do is essentially change this warping function or distortion function to accommodate for really large distortions. So one simple way of doing that is, instead of doing just a simple R square, R power 4, R power 6, we are going to use this thing called the Equidistant model or the Equi model. So in this particular case, we have this function theta, which is the angular, like the 3D angle. So it's going to be defined as tan inverse R by F. Okay. Where R is the radial distance as before, in this case in 3D, and F is basically the radius of the sphere where your model is being undistorted. Imagine in the previous case, we were doing a 2D undistortion, basically in radial coordinates. In this case, we are doing it in 3 dimensions. Okay, and in this particular case, instead of doing it simply with R, we are going to do this with theta, and we have 4 parameters K1 to K4. Again, remember that these models are based on simple assumptions about how the image is being distorted, but it works fairly well in practice, and like people have come up with these heuristical models and they work really well, and we've been using this for a while. And again, this is from almost 20 years ago, from 2006, and it works fairly well today. So then we also have this package called the OCamCalib, which basically uses an n-degree polynomial. It's currently built into MATLAB and OpenCV, which is really good for undistorting like really large field of view cameras or catadioptric or like 360 degree cameras. Similar to the one we just saw in the Equidistant model, which is really good for fisheye cameras, OCamCalib also works well for fisheye cameras. This work is from Professor Davide Scaramuzza from University of Zurich, who is one of the leading experts in SLAM and camera calibration. This is joint work with Agostino Martinelli, where Professor Martinelli works a lot on like sensor fusion, like visual inertial fusion, and I would urge you to look at his work for a lot of like early works on sensor fusion. And then they were advised by Roland Siegward, who is another amazing professor who is one of the pioneering experts in the field of simultaneous localization mapping or SLAM or 3D reconstruction. Lately, in about like 7 years ago, in 2018, there was this thing called the double sphere model, where like instead of modeling it with a single sphere, you can model it with 2 spheres, which bend this like light in a slightly different way. And this is super useful for lenses which are not manufactured to super high accuracy. So more like the ones in your smartphone or the robotics world, where we buy these cheap cameras. And this work is again from Professor Daniel Kremer's group, who is another leading expert in the field of SLAM. Let's look at a few realistic examples of different models when we take images from the GoPro like we discussed, and if we undistort it, how does it look? This is the original image. You clearly see this like distortion where straight lines are not straight. In this particular case, it resembles a parallel distortion. If you just do radial distortion, this is what it looks like. It does correct it somewhat, but it's not really that great. I also wanted to observe that we are losing the image where we are essentially zooming in because we are cropping into the image. And with the Rad-Tan model, it looks sort of okay, where straight lines look straight, but we have lost a lot of the image. If we actually like apply this to the entire image, this is what it will look like, which is basically really bad because we lose a lot of the edges of the frame. So changing this from a Rad-Tan model into something like the OCamCalib model, like we saw before from Davide Scaramuzza's group, it's a much better output, right? And straight lines remain straight. So we can do something even more. We can take the parameters from the manufacturer's datasheet as a good starting point, which essentially lets us kickstart or bootstrap these kind of methods to get good values of these parameters which were shown in red in the previous case. When we do that, we can essentially calibrate cameras which have a large field of view, in this case over 180 degrees. So in this particular case, the field of view of the cameras was 245. So if we combine two 245 degree cameras back to back, essentially what happens is you have a common field of view shown in yellow here. So because of this common field of view, you can do stereo matching in those common field of view and expand it to both the other views which don't actually have common field of view. So you can get full 360 degrees camera calibration, which is amazing. So if you have ever bought these 360 cameras, you can essentially use something like that to get full 360 degree depth data just based on this common field of view. Again, it uses manufacturer data for aiding calibration. It uses common areas to obtain stereo when field of view is greater than 200 degrees. This is work from Professor Xiaoji Shen, who is an expert in SLAM on aerial robots and has done a lot of pioneering work for exploration in aerial robots. He was a postdoc in Professor Vijay Kumar's lab, who is again another expert in the field of aerial robotics, especially controls and perception. So I talked about we are calibrating, but I did not explicitly tell you something. So what does calibration even mean? Like, okay, like you say, I'm going to sit down on my computer. I want to like look for and find the distortion. I want to calibrate. So what do I need for this, right? So as I hinted or alluded to before, we use a chess or a checkerboard, which basically is like, the straight lines are by finding the corners between these black and white squares. And you can essentially because it's a uniform grid, you can find where they are. You can use any sort of corner detector like the Harris corner detector. In the earlier days, people would sit and manually click these points. Again, it's very annoying to sit and click like 60 to 80 points per image. And if you have like 10 images, that's like 600 to 800 points. That was a little annoying, right? But we can automate these processes today and it's very simple. So you can use a chess or a checkerboard. But what people have found is this is actually not that robust. Instead, what people use today is this thing called the Charuko board, which is basically a checkerboard, but in the white squares, you have the Aruko markers. So you can easily detect these Aruko markers as well. People also use these things called the asymmetric circle calibration board, wherein you just have to detect these circles, and it's a much simpler thing than any of these things. Okay, this is all great. We do the calibration, we get some numbers. We basically put this checkerboard or Charuko board or the asymmetrical circle board. We take our camera, take multiple snapshots with different angles to sort of cover the entire frame with these patterns. And we take, let's say, 30 or 40 images, and then we feed it into one of these programs like Kalibr or MATLAB or OpenCV, and it spits out a bunch of parameters for the given chosen model. You take that model, you pass it to a function, it gives you an undistorted image. How do we know that if the image is actually good? One way is you can look at the straight lines in the undistorted image, if they actually look straight. Of course, you need to have a knowledge of what is actually straight in the real world. In the checkerboard or chessboard, it's simple. In the real world, it might be much harder. So what you can do is you can basically take the image of this cityscape as you sort of apply the distortion correction, where it's applied and not applied in the same time. You will see that the building straight lines become straighter as I start applying the distortion correction. Right? And this is what that button on your GoPro does when you say correct for the distortion. Right? And that's essentially what we're doing. Again, depending on the model, you might have to crop a lot and you might lose a lot of field of view when you do this. That's one thing to remember. So just to recap, you need a big checkerboard to essentially calibrate the cameras. Again, in this particular case, we are talking about the camera calibration where we are estimating the geometric distortion of the lens. But a similar methodology can be used to find the relative transformations extrinsically between multiple cameras as well. And this was one of the challenges that was posed to me during my master's thesis, where we had 3 GoPros. The field of view between these GoPros was, the common field of view between these GoPros was fairly small. So one of the questions we had was like, how do we actually calibrate this? Since checkerboards are relatively small, what we set out to do is let's build our own calibration board. Remember that the calibration board is fairly simple. It just needs to have some feature points which you know, and you need to know the relative locations between them. And that's what we did. We basically went out and took this wall outside of Grasp Lab at University of Pennsylvania, where we stuck these checkerboards on the entire, stuck these April tags on the entire wall. And with the limited common field of view, we only saw a few April tags which were common, as you would see in the images on the right hand side. But they were enough because we captured a lot of these images and we basically used something called a factor graph. An episode on that is coming soon, so please subscribe to the channel. And we use this factor graph method to actually find the optimal estimates of the relative transformations while finding the camera intrinsics and the geometric correction as well. A similar thing has been done on robotics platforms like the Skydio drone. Basically, it has 6 200-degree color cameras, and basically they have limited common field of view. So what they do is they have an automatic procedure where they mount this on a robotic arm and they move this around in this like checkerboard pattern like we saw in this April tag like pattern we saw before. And they have one on the floor, they have one in the walls of the room as well. And they move these like cameras around with the robotic arm in a very carefully controlled manner, and they can basically put this into a factor graph and actually get like one of the perfect calibrations. And they can do this completely automatically for every single robot, which is super important. And this is what it looks like. It goes through a series of automated movements with information. So if you look at like these talks from Tesla, again, they also do this. The first step is rectification, which is distortion correction. So this is one of the most important pivotal concepts in robot perception because we want to interpret straight lines as straight. But the question is, in the era of deep learning, do we really need to bother with these hand-calibrated mathematical models? Can we not just get away with doing this in a much simpler way? What do I mean by that? Basically, distortion can be of various forms, like we saw barrel and pincushion, but it can also be rotation, it can be symmetric, it can be wave-like distortions as shown in the right-hand side. Do we really need to mathematically model each of them? Do we need to know when what works? Can we not just generate a bunch of synthetic images and train a neural network to do the same? The answer is sort of yes, we could do that, but it's not as accurate as the mathematical models we have seen before, right? People have done this. This is called blind geometric distortion correction, and it's fairly useful when your camera lens changes on the fly and you need to accommodate a little bit of error into the mathematical model we have talked about. Just as a sidestep, so focal length and focus are slightly different things. Focus is essentially obtained by where in the real world the image is sharp, and that's dictated by the distance between the image plane and the lens. And field of view is effectively the bending power of the lens, which determines how wide can you see something. And distortion correction, what we have talked about till now, is dependent on the field of view rather than the focus. Okay, that's one thing to keep in mind. The question is, this distortion correction is great because it makes it humanly interpretable, but can we directly get away without it, directly throwing it into an optimization problem? In this particular paper, they estimate the camera pose without explicit distortion correction by using the distortion model into the mathematical optimization function where the distortion is co-estimated along with the pose of the camera, which you can definitely do. So what you can do now is you can go ahead and calibrate your own camera. So you can go to this package called Kalibr, and you will basically have to choose between projection models and distortion models. You have to choose one of each, and that's how you would calibrate the camera. In the projection model, remember, it's essentially modeling how the 3D world is being mapped onto the two-dimensional image and how you lose depth. The distortion model is essentially modeling how straight lines are getting bent to curved lines, right? That's what we are trying to talk about. In the projection model, we have 4 common things, which is the pinhole model, the omnidirectional camera model, the double spear camera model, and the extended unified camera model. They all have slightly different mathematical formulations and they work well for different kinds of cameras. I would urge you to look at the Kalibr Toolbox from ETH Zurich for more information. In the distortion models, you have the Rad-Tan model, which we saw before, the Equi model we saw before, and you also have this thing called the FOV model, which we haven't seen, but it's very similar to the Equi model. Just to recap, camera calibration involves a few things. It involves estimating this thing called the lens intrinsic parameter or the distortion parameter, Rad-Tan, Equi, and FOV. And then we have the spatial relationship between the sensor and the pinhole, which is the camera calibration matrix, and the camera body configuration or the extrinsic parameter. This combined blue and green things together is estimated by the pinhole model or the omni model or the double spear model or the OCam model. Okay, just to quickly recap, here are a few questions to see if you have understood this concept well. Why does lens distortion exist? What are the common kinds of lens distortion? How do you know if an image has been distortion corrected? What do you need to estimate lens distortion? Can you do a blind distortion correction? If so, how? See you next time. Take care. Bye-bye.